Hey everyone, I'm Dr. Phys, and let's learn some physiology. Alrighty, today we're going to talk about one of the most important topics in our physiological understanding. We're going to cover action potentials, how protein channels interact, graded potentials, and cover topics like capacitance, time and length constants, and how all of these interconnect. Using these will be able to help us figure out how the body works. So let's jump right into it. If someone were to tap you on the shoulder lightly, you probably wouldn't be too startled. You might turn around to see who it is and then go back to what you were doing. If someone were to tap on your shoulder and then punch you right in the face, then we're definitely going to react to that. The body works in the exact same way. If a cell, for example, gets hit with a little bit of sodium, it's not going to do too much. This is called a graded potential, and it always precedes something that's called an action potential. Graded potentials usually are local, and they're short, and they're either small bursts of depolarization in the cell or hyperpolarization in the cell. We'll talk about what that means. Say you were to dump a whole bunch of sodium into the system on the extracellular fluid, and then it's going to be far more likely to react. An action potential would be analogous to us getting tapped on the shoulder and then getting hit right in the face. The cell, if hit with just a little bit of sodium, not going to do too much, but the more that it keeps getting hit, it's definitely going to react. This is a good segue into something that is called action potentials. So, let's draw it out to give a better understanding of it. Can you help us out, Mr. Doodle?
Of course I can. I did not go to art school for nothing. I knew nothing about science, I will be honest with you.
Don't worry, you can just draw, I can explain it for you. Alright, so here we have a graph that explains our resting membrane potential that you guys learned in our other video. Here, the cell is comfortable. Let's say that though, you put a lot of sodium into the extracellular fluid of a space. Sodium would get in contact with that cell, and it would begin to leak through the channels. That extra positive charge would then increase the charge of the cell inside. Well, at a certain point, called threshold, the cell's voltage-gated channels will open up. And when that happens, sodium flows through the cell and potassium channels open slowly. This is called the rising phase. This happens until the cell gets to the point where the driving force, or the amount of charge that pulls ions in and out of the cell for sodium, is satisfied. And the lower potassium channels open up all the way, and the driving force for the potassium pulls the charge back down towards the original resting membrane potential. This is called the falling phase. This area that he's drawing right here is called the absolute refractory period. This area below the threshold line is deemed the relative refractory period. You see that little curve at the bottom of the graph down there on the right? Well, recall that I said that the potassium channels were slow, and the channels here are still slowly closing. They take a bit to level out and return to normal. Excess potassium in the cell will flow out leak channels. That dip is called hyperpolarization, which is a trend in potential energy in the cell that dips down on our chart. Depolarization moves to a more positive net charge, and hyperpolarization leans more towards a negative net charge. Alright, let's move on to another idea involving charge within the cell. That's called capacitance. Here's an example. These are both magnets. Say that one represents a positive charge and another represents a negative charge. If I were to put them very close together, most likely they would connect, and it would be pretty hard to pull them apart. But what if I were to place them farther away from each other? They wouldn't really do very much if I were to put them far apart though, would they? I don't feel much of a pull. And at this point, they would kind of just have their own fields. This is similar to the concept of membrane capacitance. Going back to the idea of signals being sent down an axon, and now having a deeper understanding about action potentials and capacitance, let's draw a myelin sheath on an axon. You may have heard that a myelinated neuron is more efficient and faster at sending signals. This is because the wave of positive charge is sent down by the axon by continued action potentials is faster, and there are not as many positive charges interfering and pushing on that incoming wave. When enough positive charges from ions, like Na, enter into the ICF, the neuron experiences a push in the direction of empty charge space, where more negatives are found. This triggers more action potentials and keeps the cycle going all the way down the neuron. like a bunch of dominoes, which is the difference of charge in the cell. Depending on the size of the membrane, along with other factors, that difference in charge can vary. We have a way to measure how long these waves can go. Here's the equation. The length constant, or lambda, equals the square root of Rm over Ri. Membrane resistance is the ability for the membrane to keep other ions out of it that it doesn't want. Moving down the axon can have a high length constant, especially under myelin sheaths that have very low capacitance levels. Internal resistance, Ri, is any kind of interference with this positive charge flowing down the axon. It gets in the way and slows down that charge. Say, for example, there were chunks of proteins that are negatively charged blocking the way of the positive charges moving down the axon. These overwhelming negative charges would detract the positive charges from their original path. Thus, the signal going down the axon would stop. Capacitance in this cell can be calculated by using an equation. C equals Q over V, or capacitance equals charge over voltage. When there is addition of polar molecules in the cell, we can also use capacitance equals permeativity times distance over area. This helps us figure out how capacitance is affected by more molecules being added in the cell. The time constant is how long it takes for a signal to get down its intended path. So, going back to Mr. Doodle's drawings and piecing everything together, ligand-gated channels receive an influx of sodium. That influx of sodium triggers the opening of sodium voltage-gated channels, which causes an action potential to occur in the cell. If more of these happen, a positive wave can build up in the cell and be sent down, for example, a neuron. All of this keeps happening until we get to the end of the axon. Alright, Mr. Doodle, can you help us out in showing us what happens at the end of this? All of this keeps happening until we get to the end of the axon. There, the positive charge activates calcium channels to help the calcium flow into the cell and attack snare proteins tied to the vesicles that carry something called neurotransmitters, or chemicals that transmit certain actions to other receptors. These vesicles come loose from the cell membrane and now, thanks to the plus charges, move to the end of the axon terminal, hit the wall, and through the process called exocytosis, the neurotransmitters are released into something called the synaptic cleft. There, they float towards the next neuron, attached to its receptors, and the signal continues. We can stop there for now, but a special thanks to Mr. Doodle for helping us out with this episode today.
But of course, this has been a pleasure of mine.
This has been Dr. Fizz, and until next time, stay fizzy.